Hey everyone, and welcome back to Civics Review. Today we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence specifically for what we need to know in civics. Well, let's get to it. Now, you've probably heard a lot about the Declaration of Independence already in your educational career, but in this video we're going to focus on the main ideas found in the document that makes us our own independent nation, specifically natural rights, the role of the government, and then the grievances that the colonists had with the King of England. What we won't be focusing on are the finer details, the past history, all those kinds of things. This is not a history lesson. This is just how to pass your civics test. So hold on to your butts. So the main idea of this document is it's a declaration, right? It's in the name. They're telling the world, they're shouting, we want to be independent. That's what this document does. And who's shouting that? That's the colonists who used to be a part of the UK and now they no longer are. After this document, they become their own country. And they're specifically telling the King of England, King George III, that hey, we're breaking up. This is officially over. We are no longer a part of your happy little kingdom. It is at this particular point in time I would like to point out that the Constitution of the United States is a different document. It creates the rules for our government. It establishes the three branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. Okay, and kind of creates the framework for our government. The Declaration declares or tells the world that the UK broke our hearts and we are now independent. The Constitution makes rules for our government, okay? We have to make that distinction very clear. We're going to take things to the drawing board so that we can take a closer look at the anatomy of the Declaration of Independence. This document has different parts. In civics, we need to know everything about these parts and what's contained inside them. And the first part is known as the preamble. The preamble is essentially the introduction of the Declaration, and it goes a little something like this.
When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for a battle to commence, then kaplow! I hit them with the illness of my quill. I'm endowed with certain unalienable skills.
Now, after the preamble, the next section is known as natural rights or the role of the government. The main author of the Declaration of Independence is Thomas Jefferson, and he gets very educational when trying to explain what natural rights and the role of the government are to the king in very simple terms. After Jefferson is done explaining what natural rights are and what the role of the government should be to the king, he then moves on to the next section, which is called the list of grievances. And grievances is a really big word meaning to complain. Now there's 28 specific grievances that they list in the Declaration of Independence, and they're wordy. I should point out that this takes up the majority of the document. It's just a big long list of complaints. The last section of the Declaration of Independence is known as the formal declaration. This is where we officially state we are no longer together. We are officially breaking up and going our separate ways. Okay, now that we have the basics down, we're going to talk about our boy Tommy Jeff. Now, Thomas Jefferson is the main author of the Declaration of Independence. He was actually helped by 4 other people, to which you will not be tested on your state exam. So really all we need to know is that Thomas Jefferson is the writer. But what we need to understand is that Thomas Jefferson used a lot of ideas from a guy named John Locke. So let's take a look at Locke's ideas. So John Locke comes up with a couple of ideas that heavily influence Thomas Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence, and one of those is natural rights. Now, natural rights is something we're born with, and John Locke says we're born with the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, if that sounds familiar, Thomas Jefferson said the same thing. He said in the Declaration, all men are created equal, and they have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is Thomas Jefferson essentially plagiarizing the work of John Locke and slightly changing it so that Google can't auto-detect that he's copied the work. Now, the reason why Thomas Jefferson brings this up in the Declaration is that King George III, the King of England, has been stepping over the colonists' rights to their life, their liberty and freedom, and their ability to be happy. And so that's one of the things Jefferson wants to include in his declaration. The other idea that John Locke came up with is the idea of the social contract. Now this is a little bit more tricky. The social contract tries to explain the role of government and the people, and essentially it says that we have an agreement with our government. The people are going to give up some of their power and rights, and in return the government is going to protect the rights of the people. Locke argues this is the main function of government, and if government is not doing this, if government is not protecting the life, liberty, and property of the people, then the people should rebel. The people should overthrow their government. Jefferson again feels these words describe exactly what's happening to the colonists and includes this idea in the Declaration of Independence, stating, "Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government." John Locke was a hardcore rebel. I mean, this guy really walked the walk and talked the talk, and Thomas Jefferson just had goo-goo eyes for him. He really loved all of his ideas, and you can see that in his writing of the Declaration of Independence. John Locke's ideas are all over this document. Now, to the main section of the Declaration, the grievances or the complaints. The colonists had an enormous amount of complaints about the king, about the government, and about the way things were being run in the colonies. But try to understand this fact, like wrap your brain around this, is while we're writing this breakup letter to the king, we're already shooting at each other. The Battle of Lexington and Concord has already happened, meaning we've already fired upon one another and are basically in open war. And so we are just now getting to writing this list of complaints that we have about what's going on in our country. Now, as we go through this list, one thing's going to jump out at you right away, and that it starts a lot with he. He has called, he has dissolved, and that he is referring to King George III. A lot of these are blaming the king about what's happening in the colonies. Now, we don't need to know every single one and every single complaint, but we will read through one or two so that you can see what it looks like on your test. The first one reads, "He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures." Wow, Jefferson's writing is sometimes difficult to read, but that's a typical example of something you might see on your test. All we really need to know is, yes, this is a complaint, he is King George III, and the people are complaining about something that the government or the king is doing in the colonies, in this case, making it so that the legislative bodies, the lawmakers of the countries, uncomfortable by having to do things in places they don't want to do them. There are grievances that you probably should know for your test, and the first big complaint that the colonists had was this idea about taxation without representation. And they write about that a lot in the Declaration of Independence and say, hey, it wasn't fair of you to tax us without our consent. Another big grievance that the colonists had was the quartering of soldiers, mostly in the city of Boston. 4,000 standing soldiers just hanging around, messing with people and checking on their stuff. They hated that. And the final grievance that we need to know for our test is that the king was messing with the justice system. He threw fair trials out the window, he reorganized the justice system, and the people thought this was a big violation against their rights to free and public trials. And now for the formal declaration. Thomas Jefferson has to make it very clear at the end of this document that we are never getting back together. And he's not just saying this to King George III, he's saying this to the entire planet. Like, hey everyone, we are now free and independent. Do not think of us as colonies of the United Kingdom. Please think of us as the United States of America, a new nation. What's up, everyone? We're kicking the flag out, we're kicking the king out, and we're raising up our new banner as a new country. So that's it. We've made it. We've covered the Declaration as far as civics is concerned. We didn't go over everything, but we went over the things that you're going to be tested on in this civics class. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. We'll make more videos soon.